Okay. Hi everyone. We'll begin now. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Devereux, who's a long-standing research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of poverty, food insecurity, and social protection in the global South. He's also a terrifyingly prolific writer, having written more than 70 journal articles and 9 books. And crucially for today, Stephen is bringing that pioneering expertise and work on famine and famine prevention to the context of Gaza. And I want to say that this paper has already started to have an impact, even though it only came out a few days ago. Stephen isn't on social media. I probably shouldn't be on social media, but I am. So I shared this paper on Twitter, and it already received hundreds and hundreds of likes and shares, with people furiously atting the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, various government authorities, and also legal activist groups who are seeking to bring charges against Western politicians who find themselves complicit in these staggering crimes against humanity that we see in Gaza, that, as we know in this room, are violating some of the most foundational articles of international law. And I think that the reaction to Stephen's paper shows that while at IDS we sometimes think of a disconnect between advocacy and research, or the role of research is to inform change, but in the context of Palestine, this becomes rather more difficult, where even the production of evidence can open you up to outrageous defamatory remarks, and your credentials can be questioned. You know, we can see an entire history of this, where I was looking and reminded recently about in 2007, just as the sieges started, Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, when she visited Gaza just as the siege started, said, "Their whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. It's almost unbelievable that the world doesn't care that this is happening." And similar testimony and similar pieces of evidence has been produced year on year. I mean, even now, we can just look at the insertion of the word Hamas run in front of health ministry, as if health ministries anywhere in the world are not run by the particular governing authority, and as if the UN has not found that the Hamas run health ministries' statistics are reliable year after year. So what I'm thrilled, though, is that within that milieu where research and advocacy becomes more blurred, IDS is a space where we can actually stand out from the crowd, and we can defend what I think of as the basic operating system for our work, which is international humanitarian law, and we can bring our expertise to bear on this situation. And that's what I think Stephen's working paper that we're going to hear more about has achieved wonderfully. And I encourage you all to read it, and we'll have a chance for discussion afterwards. And the final thing I should say, of course, is that the very nature of what we're going to be discussing is very traumatic and upsetting. And if you feel upset, feel free to just walk out the room. Don't feel the need to stay here. The entire situation is triggering, so there's no point doing specific trigger warnings, I think, in this case. So, Stephen, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for that very comprehensive introduction, Philip. I'm not on social media, but I believe you have 79,000 likes, I think, or followers, and I think that's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
On social media. So thank you for publicizing this work. I am not a Palestine expert. I'm a famine theorist. So what I'm trying to do is, I would say, technical work, but obviously in a highly politicized context. So inevitably it's political, but I'm not trying to make political points here about who's to blame for what. I'm just talking about whether a famine occurred in Gaza this year or not. So let's get going. Thank you. So that's the working paper that this is based on. You can see on the right a map of Gaza, which shows the areas crossing in the north, and northern Gaza, where the worst of the food crisis has been happening. Gaza City down to Khan Yunis, and then the Rafah crossing in Kerem Shalom in the south. So, what is a famine? There are many technical definitions of famine. We're not going to spend time debating them, so I'm going to give an intuitive one, which is that a famine occurs when a group of people lose all access to food until they cannot survive. So there are some common features of this definition. One is it has to be a group of people that are connected in some way, geographically, like a drought-affected region, where there are a lot of farmers or pastoralists, and sometimes in urban areas as well, besieged citizens who are blockaded and cannot get access to food. All sources of access to food. That means, Gary, there's something on the bottom of the screen. Okay. So all sources of access to food, which means production, markets, and trade, and I'll come back, and aid, and I'll come back to that, until they cannot survive, meaning they will starve, they will become destitute, there'll be malnutrition, there'll probably be mass migration and displacement in many cases, and in the worst case, mass mortality. People die. Probably the most significant book on famines in 200 years was Amartya Sen's Poverty and Famines in 1981, where he shifted our understanding of famine away from seeing it as a production crisis or lack of access or the lack of supply of food to one about access. So the idea before Sen came along was that there's not enough food to go around, and that's why people starve. Too many people, not enough food. What Sen showed is that it's actually about who gets access to available food. It's not about availability. Availability is the first prerequisite, of course, but there is enough food. It's just we don't all get access to it equally. So Sen identified 4 ways that you can access food. The first is you can grow it, which he called production-based entitlement. The second is you can buy it, which is market-based or trade-based. Third is you can be given food, which is transfer-based, and that's food aid or social protection programs, pensions, or you can borrow food from neighbors and friends, so you can be given food. Those are the 3 main sources. The fourth one was labor-based, which is that you can work for food, but that's not very common, so we won't pay any attention to that. So these are the 3 main sources of food, and they can be called physical access, economic access, and political access, because who decides who gets aid is a very political decision. Now, famines occur when sources of food are disrupted. So you can have a shock to your production. If you're a farmer and there's a drought or a flood, you lose your crop, that's a production-based failure. If you are poor and you can't afford to buy food in the market, or prices are too high, that's an economic access failure. So people who depend on purchasing foods will be affected if they're too poor or if prices are too high. And finally, if there's no aid, if aid doesn't come or it's too late, then you have a failure of transfer-based entitlements. Now, the point is that for a famine to occur, all sources of access to food have to be disrupted, right? Because if there's a production failure, you should still be able to go to the market. If the markets aren't there or prices are too high, you should still get aid. So this raises the question, is famine a natural disaster? Common causes of crop failure include drought, flood, insects like locusts or crop blight, and cold snaps, which was very common in European famines of the past. But famine is not a natural disaster. A drought or a flood can trigger a crop failure, but it's not enough to say that equals famine. Drought is not famine. Drought causes harvest failure, production collapse. But for a famine to occur, you have to ask, well, why was there no response to the markets? Why didn't people buy food? Why didn't traders bring food into the area so that there was enough food supply to compensate for the loss of production? If there's not enough food in the markets or people can't afford to buy food in the markets, why was there no food aid? So when a famine happens, it means not only is there a supply shock, food supply shock, there's also a failure of markets or a poverty problem, and there's also a failure of aid to come and respond in time. So the idea that famine is a natural disaster is not enough. It's often the trigger, but for a natural disaster or natural hazard to become a famine, you must also have an economic crisis, market failure or poverty or both, and you must also have a political failure because there should have been intervention. The government or the World Food Programme should have come along and saved people before they reached starvation. We need food every day, but it takes several weeks or months for starvation to happen. So it's not just a natural disaster, it's an economic crisis and a political failure as well. And sometimes there's no natural disaster at all. There's no shock to food production. Sometimes famine is a political success. Sometimes famine is intentional. And the most obvious example of that is siege famines. When people are blockaded, cut off from food supplies, not allowed to get out to look for food, food is not allowed in, and they starve. A very notorious example of a siege famine was the Warsaw Ghetto, World War II, which was part of the Nazis' hunger plan. The Nazi governor of Poland said, "We sentenced 1.2 million Jews to die of hunger in the Warsaw Ghetto." So there was an intentional, it was part of a bigger plan actually, where the Nazis planned to starve something like 20 million people in Eastern Europe and Russia. And they starved many millions actually, in Warsaw, in Leningrad, in Minsk, other cities, even in Eastern Netherlands, as part of this hunger plan, partly as a weapon of war, partly also to seize food and use it to feed the German army. So 92,000 Jewish residents of the Warsaw Ghetto died of starvation in the 1940s during the siege of Warsaw. Leningrad as well, a very similar situation. The German army and the Finnish army surrounded Leningrad and cut people off from access to food. And that's probably the worst siege famine in terms of mortality. More than 600,000 people died from hunger or hunger-related diseases. Towards the end of the war, in the Eastern Netherlands, the Dutch resistance to the Nazis, I think they blew up some trains and bridges and disrupted Nazi supplies. So in retaliation, the Germans cut off part of Eastern Netherlands, wouldn't allow people out. And there was a small famine, relatively 20,000 people are estimated to have died. So siege famines are intentional famines. They're not like other famines because they're not triggered by natural shocks to food production. They are triggered by people being deprived of access to food. It's not about availability, it's all about access. So why am I mentioning siege famines? Because we had a look at Gaza. And what has happened in Gaza in the last year and a bit. Remember the framework for understanding famines. Famines happen when there is a failure of production, a failure of markets or trade, and a failure of transfers. So you must have disruption to all three sources for a famine to occur. So we'll look at Gaza, and we'll look first at production-based entitlements. Immediately after October the 7th, the Israeli Defense Force started an assault on Gaza, which included bombings, shellings, razing of fields, and so on. And the dark patches in this map from November show the areas that had already been damaged by the Israeli campaign. Mostly, as you can see, in northern Gaza, the northern Gaza governorates up to Gaza City. That's in November. 2 months later, in January, you can see the orange patches have spread much further down south and are much more intense up north. And by that point, it was estimated that more than 40% of cropland had been damaged. Irrigated land, rain-fed land, and orchards, including olive orchards, that wells had been damaged, greenhouses had been damaged, and this significantly reduced the capacity of people in Gaza to produce food for their own consumption. Even before October the 7th and before the blockade started, Gaza depended heavily on food imports, especially humanitarian aid. They were not self-sufficient. It's a very densely populated, very small area of not very productive land. And so they were depending on trucks bringing in food. 500 trucks would come in on average every day before October the 7th. So this was a small part of their access to food. The main part is actually trade and aid. So let's look at market-based entitlements to food. As you can see by the line on the bottom, it's pretty flat. This shows you the food price index, the consumer price index for food in Gaza from December 22 to September 23. It's pretty flat. And then what happens after September, specifically after October the 7th, food prices doubled in 3 months. Food prices doubled in 3 months and they continued to rise during 2024. So there was a massive spike in food prices in a population already very poor, where food supplies were already stretched, and that had predictable consequences. Israel was being accused of using starvation as a weapon of war by targeting, I'm saying accused because there is contestation around all of these facts. But here is a photograph of a bakery that was bombed, for example. People are queuing for food aid, but a bakery just behind them has been bombed. And Human Rights Watch put out a report accusing Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war, saying it was deliberate that the humanitarian and commercial imports of food to Gaza were being restricted intentionally by Israel. The World Food Programme agreed in November. They said only 10% of necessary food supplies had been entering Gaza since the beginning, since October the 8th. And this was causing a massive food gap and hunger because even the normal regular supplies of food were not coming in and they were cutting back to below subsistence levels. The blockade at the border crossings was seen on televisions. There were many ways that the trucks were refused access. They wouldn't get a permit, they wouldn't have permits, they would spend a lot of time searching the trucks, they would deny aid agencies access. So a lot of restrictions and obstacles were put in the way of aid and trade coming into those couple of crossing points into Gaza during this time. Refugee International also put out a report saying siege and starvation, how Israel obstructs aid to Gaza. So this is looking at the humanitarian deliveries of food rather than the commercial deliveries of food. They were both affected, but the aid obstruction was seen as the most severe. There is a 60-kilometer barrier around the Gaza Strip, which was built in 1971 originally, ostensibly to keep Israelis safe from Palestinian attacks, but it's now used rather as a control mechanism to stop food getting in to Gaza. And so those few crossings are easily used as a way of turning the taps on and off. So the 60 kilometers of barrier are militarized. And the defense minister is actually the person who announced the siege of Gaza on the 8th of October. Specifically, Yoav Gallant, who you might remember was recently fired by Netanyahu about a week, 10 days ago. He ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip. He says, I have ordered a complete siege. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. He also added, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. Now, this statement, there will be no food, in my opinion, is already an intentional declaration of a war crime. And members of the Knesset agreed with him. So here's a Knesset member who said, in responding to this declaration, without hunger and thirst among the Gaza population, we will not be able to bribe people with food, with drink, with medicine in order to achieve intelligence. So again, it was explicit that the siege and the use of food, deprivation of food, was a deliberate strategy to achieve war aims, military aims. So what's interesting about this? Well, there are many things which are shocking about this, in my view, but one thing that's really interesting is that it's not the first time. The use of food against the people of Gaza has been happening for at least 20 years. In 2003, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food did a mission to Gaza, where he reported that he found a terrible situation of malnutrition, quote. He concluded, quote, the government of Israel as the occupying power in the territories has a legal obligation under international law to ensure the right to food of the civilian Palestinian population. It is failing to meet this responsibility. So in 2003 already, it was clear that not enough food was being allowed into Gaza. In 2006, 2007, it became worse in response to, I think it was one of the intifadas in 2005. An advisor to the prime minister said, we're going to put the Palestinians on a diet, not to make them die of hunger. Okay, and then in 2007, the Ministry of Health was tasked with calculating the minimum basket of food for the people of Gaza sufficient for their subsistence. And what you have on the right is actually the table that was compiled of the amount of food that was estimated to be needed to keep people alive in Gaza, but not much more than that. And that was used as a basis for allowing a certain amount of food into Gaza for the next 4 years. I think it was only withdrawn in 2011. This has really uncanny resonances with the way that the Jews were treated in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, so what Israel is doing has been challenged under international law, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court describes genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. One of the crimes against humanity that's listed in Article 7 is the deprivation of access to food, calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population. And under Article 8, which is about war crimes, so they've got genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. One of the war crimes, number 25, intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival and willfully impeding relief supplies. I don't think that anybody would deny that this number 7b and number 825 have been happening in the last year. The evidence is overwhelming. In December, last December, South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice. I happen to be South African, and so I was following those proceedings very closely. I should mention that South Africa and Palestine have got a very close historical link. When Nelson Mandela became president in 1994, he said, very famously said, South Africa will not be free until Palestine is also free. And the discourse in South Africa is that what's happening in Palestine has a lot of resonances with apartheid South Africa. So there's a lot of sympathy and empathy for the suffering that's happening in Gaza right now, and the West Bank, actually. So the ICJ got this representation from South Africa, where they accused, the ICJ prosecutes countries. So it's South Africa taking Israel to court. The ICC prosecutes individuals, which I'll come to. So the ICJ initiated proceeding against Israel, asserting acts of genocide, including the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, Israel's failure to provide or ensure essential food, which has pushed into the brink of famine, and causing widespread hunger, dehydration, and starvation to besieged Palestinians in Gaza. Those were the accusations. And the court ruled broadly in favor, not saying that there was genocide happening, but saying that there is a possibility, there's a potential that genocidal acts are being committed, and that Israel had an obligation to allow humanitarian access. They didn't, what South Africa wanted the ICJ to tell Israel to stop hostilities immediately, for there to be a ceasefire. They didn't do that, but they did say there's a potential of genocidal acts to be happening, and therefore that Israel should allow humanitarian access, and they should report every month on the actions that they're taking to allow humanitarian access. As far as I know, Israel has reported once, I think in February. That was not made public, so we don't know what they reported or whether the response was adequate, but I haven't heard anything since then that Israel has reported. If anybody knows, that would be interesting to hear. So after that deposition in December, South Africa went back 3 times, once to try and stop the assault on Rafah, which was unsuccessful. And the second time in March was to argue that famine was happening or about to happen in Gaza, and that the ICJ should stop it by telling Israel to allow humanitarian access. So South Africa went back a second time, and the ICJ again ruled broadly in favor of South Africa. They concluded that Palestinians in Gaza, quote, are no longer facing only a risk of famine, but that famine is setting in. The state of Israel should take all necessary and effective measures to ensure without delay the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food. Okay, so they were telling Israel there is a severe food problem in Gaza. You are responsible. You have to stop it. Okay, then in May, the ICC put out applications for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, who had imposed the siege, accusing them of criminal responsibility for war crimes against the people of Palestine, including, first one, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and a war crime contrary to the statute of Rome. That was the first of the indictments made against them. And I think it's important to note that they do accept that Israel has a right, or they do say that Israel has a right to take action to defend its population, but they also say that does not absolve Israel or any state of the obligation to comply with international humanitarian law. Any military goals that Israel might have does not justify intentionally causing death, starvation to the civilian population. In fact, that's criminal according to the ICC, and that's why they issued the arrest warrants. I would also mention that on the same day, they applied for arrest warrants against leaders of Hamas for what happened on October the 7th. Okay, now I'm going to get a bit technical. There is an international body called the IPC, Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which assesses food crises all over the world and decides whether they are crisis, emergency, catastrophe, or famine. So they are responsible for doing the analysis that then leads governments or the United Nations to declare famines. They don't declare famines themselves, they do the analysis. So they are technical people, and they have criteria for deciding whether a certain situation at a certain time should be classified as a famine. So they have these measures. 20% of households face extreme lack of food. That's not very easily measurable. 30% of children suffering from acute malnutrition. That's SAM, severe acute malnutrition. That can be measured. It's not easy to measure in a conflict situation, but it can be measured. And finally, the mortality indicator, which is a very rigorous and I would say a high bar, is that there have to be deaths of 2 people every day or per 10,000 population, or 4 children every day per 10,000, due to outright starvation or the interaction of malnutrition and disease, so hunger or hunger-related diseases. So in other words, they won't declare famine. They will declare food crisis or emergency or even catastrophe, but they won't say it looks like a famine is happening until that threshold of 2 adults or 4 children per day are dying, which in my view is too late. And because it's a very high bar, they don't declare famines very often. But they do have this technical way of doing it. So let's see whether Gaza qualifies. So the IPC's analysis has found that famine conditions are occurring in 4 situations since 2010. They actually started in about 2007. The first one was a very well-known famine that happened in Somalia in 2011, the last major famine that we're all aware of. But there have been smaller famines in South Sudan, 2017 and 2020. And in July this year, the IPC concluded that there is a famine situation happening in Sudan itself. So 4 famines since 2010. And Gaza is not on the list. They did not declare that a famine was happening in Gaza. Why not? Well, when it became clear that the food situation in Gaza was deteriorating, they did do an assessment. In fact, they did 3 assessments. And we're going to look at each of these assessments. The first one was done in December. That's 2 months after the conflict started in October. Second in March, and the third in June. So in December, the IPC concluded that there is a risk of famine. They found that 93% of the population of Gaza, which is just over 2 million people, were living in crisis, emergency, or catastrophe. That's from level 3 to 5. And that's a risk of famine was actually high, but there wasn't yet a famine. The second assessment in March is the crucial one, because in this one, they concluded that famine is imminent. Famine is about to happen in Gaza. 96% of the population were now seen to be in level 3 or above, and 677,000, which is about 1/3 of the population of Gaza, were living in phase 5. There's a bit of a problem here because phase 5 is actually when they declare famine, but they have this catastrophe first, and then they have famine also under phase 5. It's a little bit confusing, but basically catastrophe means households are living in famine conditions, but there isn't enough at the broad scale for there to be 2 deaths of adults or 4 deaths of children per 10,000 population, which means that a famine is declared at the area level. So you could say that these 677,000 people were experiencing a famine, but the area overall of northern Gaza was not yet declared to be in a famine situation. So that's the crucial one, because what happened then, in June, the numbers came down. A high risk of famine persists, but famine was no longer imminent. So what happened between March and June? And did they get it wrong? Well, we have to look at what their projections were and why the projections changed. So these are the numbers in phase 5, December, March, and June. From December, looking at what had happened October, November, December, they projected forward to March, and their projection was that by March, there would be 576,000 people in level 5, phase 5, which actually turned out to be an underestimate because the actual number, when they came to March to do the assessment in March, was 100,000 higher. So they're under-projected. However, the second projection, assuming that conditions stayed the same, was that the numbers continued to rise, and in fact that the figure would double between March and June. Because it had doubled more or less from here to here, things were just getting worse. So it was quite logical for the IPC to say, unless things change, we're going to see 1 million people living in catastrophe, and almost certainly at that point they would have declared a famine. But they didn't declare a famine because the numbers went in the opposite direction. So let me just show you this graphically. 377,000 people in December in phase 5. They projected 576 in March, but actually 100,000 more were assessed to be in catastrophe in March. Based on that assessment, they projected an increase, linear increase more or less, to 1.1 million. But what actually happened is when they did the assessment in June, and instead of going up in a linear way, it went down. It went back even below what it had been in December. So that's where they got it wrong. What they said, so the next thing that happens after the IPC does their analysis is that an independent body called the Famine Review Committee reviews the analysis and decides whether they agree, whether it's credible, and if they want to declare a famine or not. So the Famine Review Committee reviewed the analysis in December, and they agreed with the IPC that the risk of famine is high and is going to continue increasing as long as conflict persists and restricted humanitarian access persists. In March, they also agreed with the IPC analysis. Famine is now projected and imminent in northern Gaza, again, unless there's a cessation of hostilities and full access to provide food. So those are the conditions under which they made their projections. In June, the FRC concluded the available evidence does not indicate that famine is occurring because of several important developments that happened since the second review. Most importantly, the amount of food allowed into the northern governorates steadily increased. So after the second assessment was done, suddenly a lot more trucks were allowed in. And that increased food supply, reduced the number of people living in catastrophe. They did point out that the conflict was ongoing, and as long as the conflict is ongoing, the risk of famine persists. But the food aid situation had eased. The Israeli press was delighted that the IPC had got it wrong. The IPC officials were chastised by the media in Israel. UN official admits no evidence of famine. UN official admits lack of data indicating famine. Key food security organization, that's the IPC and FRC, finds no famine in Gaza, says previous assumptions were wrong. Well, they didn't say previous assumptions were wrong. What they said was, under current conditions, a famine is going to happen, right? Unless the conditions change. So it wasn't even an assumption. It was just looking at the situation and saying, ceteris paribus, famine is going to happen. What happened is the Israeli government responded, we think, to this assessment by realizing they were on the brink of being condemned by the world for intentionally, deliberately, malevolently creating a famine, causing thousands of people to starve to death. And in order to avoid the bad publicity from that and possible legal consequences of that, they pulled back. They allowed some food trucks in. That's what happened. It's also possible at the same time, it was the attack on the kitchen, what are those people called? World Central Kitchen. That happened and some aid workers were killed, and Biden apparently got on the phone to Netanyahu and said, this has to stop. You've got to allow humanitarian access in. You can't keep killing aid workers. And so a combination of external pressure from IPC on the one hand, from USA on the other, contributed to Israel relaxing the restrictions on aid, the blockade. Okay, so there was no famine, right? There was no famine. Well, it depends, actually. It depends. So in July, which is well after the relaxing of humanitarian access, UN experts, including the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and many other special rapporteurs, high-level UN people, said a famine is happening. And they gave us evidence on the left here. 34 Palestinians have died from malnutrition. When the first child dies from malnutrition, it becomes irrefutable that famine has taken hold. Well, it's not true if you're going to use the IPC definition, because the IPC wants to have 4 children dying every day before they'll say this is a famine. What these people are saying is, if one child dies of starvation who shouldn't have died of starvation, only because they were deprived of access to food, isn't that a famine? So it depends how you define famine. There's another agency, not IPC, which is under the FAO and the United Nations, but FuseNet, which is under USAID. It was set up as an early warning system. It actually means famine early warning system, which was set up after the famines in Africa in the 1980s to monitor food crises. And they do their own assessments independently of IPC. And they did an assessment in March and April, and they concluded, even using the IPC thresholds, that a famine had occurred. Well, they said it is possible or likely that all 3 IPC thresholds, food consumption, malnutrition, and mortality, were surpassed in northern Gaza in April, and that the situation will persist at least through July. So they submitted their analysis to the Famine Relief Committee, this independent body, and the FRC did not find the evidence plausible. The one reason is that it's really difficult to get good data on how many children are dying in the middle of a conflict when bombs are falling and there's access denied even to aid workers and international community. Al Jazeera was kicked out and other NGOs were kicked out. So you can't really get the data. And so the FRC, which is very conservative, it doesn't want to take any unnecessary risks and declare famine if it's not a genuine famine. They pulled back and they said, it's possible, but we don't think that the evidence is strong enough. Therefore, we are unable to make a determination. That's what they said here. Underneath that black text, it says the FRC is unable to make a determination as to whether or not famine occurred in April. So they're not saying it didn't happen, but they're saying the evidence isn't strong enough. FuseNet does think the evidence is strong enough. The World Food Programme also thought the evidence was strong enough. They also said a famine's happening in northern Gaza. So looking at these thresholds and whether we should take the IPC's thresholds as definitive as to whether a famine is happening, it made me reflect back on work that a lot of people have done earlier on trying to define famines operationally in order to prevent them, in other words. You only define things to prevent things. So Alex Duval, a very famous famine expert, wrote a book in 1989 called Famine That Kills. And he noted that in Darfur, in Sudan, people have different names for different types of famines, depending on their intensity. And famine that kills is only the worst type of famine. There are also famines that cause hunger, and there are famines that cause destitution, and there are famines that cause displacement. And all these famines have different names, but they're all called famines by the people of Darfur. You don't have to have 4 children dying every day for the people of Darfur to say, this is a famine. An Indian academic called Amrita Rangasamy wrote a paper in 1993 talking about the famine process, where she said a famine is not an event. It's not like thousands of people in a refugee camp all starving to death. It's actually a process that starts a year or two earlier with the first harvest failure or the first production shock. And that's the incipient famine. That's the start of the process. It matures and it becomes full-blown famine, which is the end of the process. It's not an event which suddenly happens and then goes away again. It's a process. And then the next one is the famine intensity scale, which Paul Howe, who was a PhD student here, I was his supervisor. We worked on this idea together in the early 2000s. He's now the director of the Famine Center at Tufts University. And the famine intensity scale also has 5 phases and also has some of the thresholds that the IPC uses. In fact, the famine scale that Paul Howe and I, mostly Paul Howe, devised was widely credited as informing the IPC scale, which is called the Acute Food Insecurity Intensity Scale. So it's very similar, but what's different from us and them is that we weren't scared to use the F word. So if you look at these other definitions, you'll see Alex Duval talks about famine, famine, famine. Rangasamy talks about famine, famine, famine. We also talk about famine, famine, famine from phase 3 onwards. But the IPC doesn't want to use the F word. They're very scared of using the F word. So they won't declare a famine until it's well over the thresholds that they've imposed for defining famine and declaring it for international mobilization of aid. As I said, for conservative reasons. And my argument, my view, is that this is one reason why we are failing to prevent famines, because there have been several famines that have not been prevented. And I think one reason is they're not declared in time. If we said, for example, we're not seeing mass mortality yet, but there is a famine process underway, and we could have seen that already in Gaza in December or January, that a famine process was underway. It might or might not lead to thousands of people dying, but even if it doesn't, we can say confidently, this is a famine process. And that's what IPC did, in fact. They said famine is imminent, meaning their definition of famine is imminent, because they could see that the process was underway. If they hadn't sent some trucks in after March, that line would have continued going up, thousands of people would have died, and there would have been a famine in their definition. But clearly, a famine process was underway, starting at least in December, January. Okay, so I wrote this working paper. It came out, and I thought, well, it's late October, early November. It's over, right? The worst of it is over. Until last Friday. And then the IPC, actually the FRC, I think the FRC also has endorsed this. The IPC put out an alert saying it's happening again. Because on the 1st of October, Israel imposed another blockade on northern Gaza. It's not entirely clear why, although there is something called the General's Plan, which might be behind it, but I won't go into that. We can maybe come to that in Q&A. So they reimposed the blockade in Gaza. It's said that people are now faced with the choice of, if they haven't evacuated already, they must flee. If they don't flee, they're going to be either starved or shot, because there's a plan to evacuate parts of northern Gaza. So the IPC put out this alert last Friday saying the humanitarian situation in Gaza is extremely grave and rapidly deteriorating. There's a strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. This is exactly what they were saying in March. Because the population was already so much weakened, it didn't take very long. It took a couple of weeks from early October to late October for us to be back there where we were in March, or I should say for people in northern Gaza to be in that situation. They are saying starvation, malnutrition, excess mortality are rapidly increasing in the northern Gaza Strip. Famine thresholds, that's their own indicators, may already have been crossed or else will be in the near future. So they are saying the famine is about to happen in Gaza, just like they said in March. Whether Israel will listen to this and will back off again, like they did in April, we'll see. But right now, the situation is very serious in northern Gaza. I'm going to end with this chilling quote, I think. In August, the finance minister of Israel said, "No one in the world will allow us to starve 2 million people, even though it might be justified and moral in order to free the hostages." I think it's a very sad world when people can say things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Stephen, that I think combined both capturing the severity of the situation, but also introducing people in a really clear and lucid way around how we classify famines. So if I can just abuse my my chair privilege to ask the first question. When reading the paper and listening to you speak, I wonder whether or not, and what your opinion is of the idea that IPC classifications are particularly unsuitable for siege famines.
Mm-hmm.
Whether there's something particular about, of course, politics is involved in all these famines, but this is since an intentionally imposed deprivation of food. And it reminds me of when the F word was used in Yemen, which was then used to scare the Saudis to stop bombing agricultural production sites. And whether the IPC, is particularly unsuitable in this situation.
Yeah, that's a good point, which I haven't thought of, but the IPC scale was devised for what we might call conventional famines, usually triggered by drought, or usually drought, crop failure in rural areas of Africa. And then you observe an intensification of malnutrition, destitution, food prices rising, and eventually mortality. So it's quite likely that they didn't think about whether they need to adjust this for urban contexts, for siege contexts. And when you think about it, yes, it is a very different situation. Mm-hmm. And I think what's maybe unique about it is the fact that you can see, just looking at those three assessments, how rapidly and irreversibly the food situation deteriorates if the situation doesn't change, if you have conflict ongoing and you have the deprivation of humanitarian access, which you can only do in situations like that. And there are very few situations like that now. In World War II, there were many cities that were besieged. We don't see that now, but Gaza is literally like the Warsaw Ghetto in that sense. It's completely cut off. Israel completely controls food supplies into and out and people's mobility out of Gaza. So it's a very different context. And I would certainly agree that we need to look differently at how we define famine in that context. But I also should mention, of course, that it's a complex situation. It's what we used to call complex emergencies, where conflict is the main problem, right? And this famine that's going on is almost a side story to the main story, in the sense that probably conservatively a few hundred people have starved to death. We know that 30,000 or more have died. So it's not the main part of the story. It's one strategy that's being used in the war against the people of Palestine, of Gaza. But it's sufficiently, I would say, concerning that it deserves attention in its own right. But it's only part of the broader picture of conflict and complex emergency that's going on there.
You take some questions from the room, or yeah?
Oh, sorry. Why do you think IPC has such a conservative definition? And to what extent the very fact that there is a threshold makes that definition vulnerable to political manipulation of the sort that you described, right? So the Israeli government can adjust the level of aid just to make sure that that threshold is not surpassed. So the very existence of the threshold seems to be highly problematic. So what are the, if you can tell us a little bit about, the politics behind all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. I think the second part of your question confirms Philip's point, which is that if you put a threshold there, it becomes subject to political manipulation, which you would never have dreamed of happening in old-style drought famines, right? That's not an issue. It's become an indicator that can be calibrated and used strategically. as we've seen now in Gaza, but it was never thought that that would be a function of it. So why it's conservative is because the IPC is under FAO, which is part of the United Nations. And so they have to be extremely cautious when they make a definitive statement about anything. As you know, if you've ever edited a UN document, you know how fussy they are about getting things exactly right. If they make a declaration of famine, it immediately triggers all kinds of things. There's an obligation of the international community to respond. WFP will make a humanitarian appeal. The United States and other countries will have to get food aid mobilized and get it to the area as quickly as possible. Nowadays, with the conflict element, there's a potential for war crimes and genocidal actions to be taken against those countries where famines are happening that weren't prevented, especially if they're intentional. So there's all kinds of ripple effects once you declare a famine. And they are very nervous about declaring a famine and getting it wrong because of this issue about crying wolf. You know, if you say, I mean, even to be honest, if you look at WFP's appeals for aid, you sometimes see these things like 500,000 people at risk in Yemen. And then you look a couple of months later at the news and nothing has happened in Yemen. So there's always this concern that they don't want to be seen as crying wolf and taking premature decisions, which could have long-lasting implications for their credibility. Yeah.
It's kind of a follow-up question. Like, do you think that, because I was just Googling like, oh, who funds the IPC? Because to me, that can tell you a lot about how and why people operate. You think that like like if you look at the UN, there will be certain countries that will bring to General Assembly or Council saying, you know, Israel is committing a war crime, and then sort of like the Israeli lobby within the UN will counter that, or the US vetoes it, right? If you're talking about the Security Council. So do you think that has an effect as well? Is like this fear of crying wolf, but also this like hidden power of the lobby that exists? Because it's like one thing for Biden to say, stop bombing World Food Kitchen, but you're still selling arms to Israel. So do you think that's a factor as well? And maybe that was sort of answered before. I don't know.
You know, it's very difficult to make this leap from a technical assessment of whether famine criteria are being met in an area at a certain time to saying that whether a famine is declared or not declared is due to political interference in that assessment process. In other words, I do believe that what the IPC does is technically as rigorous as they can be. What the IPC doesn't do is declare famine. What they do is they provide the information to powerful actors that can declare famine. Whether they, and then the FRC is the next gatekeeper, which decides whether they accept the IPC analysis. Once they do that, they will then say, yes, there's a famine, or no, there isn't a famine. Is there political pressure on any of those actors? Honestly, I have no idea. We do know that in the case of the ICC, International Criminal Court, it's quite unlikely that these criminal prosecutions will ever get through the entire system because of the power of various lobbies and interest groups to stop and block. But when it comes to assessment of famine, I do believe it's a technical exercise. What happens after the analysis is done, it's a black box. Nobody knows if it's politicized or not. I mean, I don't know if it's politicized or not. I'm hoping and assuming not.
Yeah. Shall we take two or three?
I'm just wondering that now that the UNRWA ban is has to come effect in January 2025, and I'm just wondering that whatever must have led to sort of letting go through of those trucks after March IPC review happened and the numbers dropped down. Even after the, as you showed, the 7 November from the IPC, the famine risk, and saying that it's imminent, and yet the UNRWA ban is going to come into effect in January, as they've said by now. Do you think a similar thing, do you think there's whatever must have led to that taking back of that step and like letting go of the aid is not going to happen? Is that, I don't know, is that idea not there anymore? Like, yeah, like, is there no way? I mean, I don't know how to frame this question, but yeah, just the fact that the UNRWA ban is coming into place from January,
Yes,
does that principle not apply anymore?
yes, you can answer that.
I'm answering a few questions as well. We previously agreed. I think what your question is kind of getting at is the issue of impunity, basically. That previously we saw that when the announcement that famine was imminent, there was a response. More Israel is allowed to violate fundamental articles of international humanitarian law with no consequence, more they will continue to push the boundaries of what they can do. So the banning of UNRWA was unthinkable. It had significant reaction even from, the more difficult members of the Security Council were shocked by that decision. What's happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So will they then look at increasing famine data, or will they then look at reactions to UNRWA and repeal the ban? I mean, I genuinely think not, but of course there is always the possibility. But the risks of allowing this to occur in Gaza already have spread to Lebanon. Already the same, responses. There's bombing of agricultural land in Lebanon. There's bombing of rural production facilities in Lebanon. You can see the consequence of impunity. And yeah, I would think that as Stephen was saying, the real issue is also that the IPC scale, because the way it functions in this case is it does potentially allow for that possibility that it gets towards an assessment and then they allow the aid trucks in. But I think that we should not ever rely on that. And what we should rely on are the articles of international humanitarian law that are universally applicable. And that means universally applicable.
It was essentially the same question about the Knesset's decision on UNRWA and logistical implications for possible acceleration of the famine without the infrastructure to support food distribution. But thank you.
Yeah. I mean, UNRWA is the backbone of the aid operation. So without UNRWA, you wouldn't be able to respond. I mean, we might see the same farcical scenes of airdrops, which are not really used in landlocked countries with huge amounts of roads that are near a sea, which have killed people in the process. That was my other question I was going to ask of you soon. What do you think about airdrops?
No. Yeah.
I just want to ask a question about the technical method that the IPC uses to make its projections and estimates, because as we know, Gaza is no longer a congruous territory. You can't really pass from one area to another without the approval and also posing yourself a lot of risk from Israeli attacks. And so how is the IPC able to do its assessment? How are they able to access places, and how can they confidently claim that these numbers are accurate, given that the conflict in Gaza has seen the death of more UN people than any other global conflict in decades, given the impunity of attacks on humanitarian actors? Yeah, I mean, just recently, the bombing of the cholera vaccination tent, it just doesn't strike me as a place where you can confidently make claims about numbers, given the huge problem of lack of access. So how have they counted this problem? And what methods are they using technically to make these estimates?
Yeah, again, it goes back to Philip's point at the beginning, is that when they set up these scales, they thought they'd be dealing with stable populations, either in rural areas or in refugee camps, IDP camps, where they can be weighed and measured and the food consumption can be monitored and all of that. And now you're dealing with a conflict situation where it's a blockade, where you're not allowed in, where you can't travel around freely. And so also in Sudan, actually, when they made the declaration in Sudan, it actually applied to one refugee camp. They said a famine is happening in one refugee camp because they couldn't get out. They couldn't look beyond the refugee camp. So they wanted to at least say there is a famine happening, but we can only confidently say it's happening in this refugee camp where we have data. In Gaza, they are talking mostly about the northern governorates, probably because things do seem to be worse there, but also because I think of limited access. And I think that another reason why they are reluctant to declare famine is because they don't have confidence in the data. They haven't got enough data to make a declaration with as much. You see, when they talk about declaring famine conditions are going on, it has to be, number one, that they've passed the thresholds, and number two, that the data are credible. And so they looked at the FuseNet data, which all said we are over the thresholds, according to FuseNet. But the Famine Review Committee said, we do not think that the data are credible enough because you haven't got enough of a sample size. We're not sure how you got the data. So it's about the quality of the data as well as reaching the thresholds. And that additional factor means that it's even less likely that you're going to see a famine declared in a situation like Gaza. So it's another reason why they get more conservative and don't declare famine. Whereas World Food Programme, the executive director visited northern Gaza in April and looked and spoke to people on the ground and said, this is a famine, there's a famine happening here. And she went on the world's media and said so. She wasn't waiting to count the dead babies.
Chloe?
Thanks for your presentation. I'm going to be one of the annoying people that kind of make a comment rather than a question, but I'd like to hear your reflections on it, which is one of the theoretical frameworks that I've found most helpful for understanding Israel's violence in Palestine is Poir's work on the politics of maiming and how Israel very often uses deliberate tactics of debilitation and disabling the population, stopping just short of killing for two reasons. One, debilitation as a form of control over the colonized population, and two, to avoid the optics of collateral damage. Or in other words, a Palestinian said to me, Palestinians aren't just unlucky because we're occupied, but we're unlucky because we're occupied by an army that makes itself look to the rest of the world like it's not violent. And I thought that this year, this framework didn't hold anymore because Israel obviously isn't trying to not look like it's violent anymore. And your presentations made me think very differently, actually, that still holds, that Israel is deliberately disabling and debilitating the population. So I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on maiming as a form of control and also kind of avoiding those optics, and if you think that applies.
Should I take it?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. As I said at the beginning, I'm trying to keep my comments and my analysis technical, but just looking at what's happening, the constant evacuation orders, people having to move up and down Gaza looking for shelter, and bombing of schools and hospitals and even refugee camps and food trucks and so on. It's clearly part of a debilitation strategy. And the answer that they always give when they're challenged is, oh, but there were some Hamas fighters there, sheltering among the civilians. So that is a cover for all kinds of actions being taken against civilians, which are clearly illegal under international law, on the pretext that there might have been some Hamas fighters there or in tunnels under the school or whatever. It's part of a strategy to debilitate the population, there's no doubt. And this latest initiative called the General's Plan seems like an even more extreme version of that, which is to depopulate parts of northern Gaza and then either occupy it for administrative purposes or start filling it up with illegal settlements. We don't know yet. But it seems to me that we can't just assume that what's happening is, as some people seem to think, just random attacking against Palestine, that Netanyahu doesn't have a plan. And there's no day after. I think there is a day after. I think there's a very clear plan. And part of it is this general's plan. And every action that they're taking against the people of Palestine suggests that it's about debilitating and keeping the population unstable, destabilized and debilitated. And just to get away from making my political opinion and back towards the technical analysis, the evidence on the control of food way back in the early 2000s tells us that they have used access to food continuously for the last 20 years. I saw a figure somewhere that the average Palestinian's food consumption, is 40% of an average Israeli citizen's food consumption. So on one side of the fence, you're getting 40% of what people on the other side of the fence are eating, even with 500 trucks going in a day. And right now it's down to less than 200 trucks a day. So yeah, it's part of a bigger strategy. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, and reading the paper, Chloe, I was also exactly reminded of Jasper Poir's argument, because I had exactly the same thought, that maiming as a tactic of control has lessened, because now we just have open open tax. But then when you look at the data and the way the famine goes like this, as well as the fact, of course, famines and hunger causes long-term health problems. So it is also a direct form of maiming, but it also replicates that pattern of just constantly going to the edge. And then when the aid trucks go in, you can say, look at all these aid trucks. But you've already taken that population to the edge and probably caused long-term health consequences for those who've been exposed for months on end. So I think that is a very good comment. Are there any questions online? Okay. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the situation in Gaza relates to other contemporary famines and whether there's some kind of communality you can talk about, what's a modern famine or a contemporary famine in that sense. I guess one thing that occurs is maybe this kind of like disputed definition of famine. Like I know that was a feature of the Bengal famine in 43 as well, but like maybe that's something that's become more prominent in, I don't know.
We just had a lecture this morning, so maybe some of the students from the food politics class can answer that question. We were talking this morning about how famines have evolved. In my work, I've identified 3 phases. The first phase was the old style famines where it's a supply shock like a drought, and then there's Malthusian theories, and it's too many people, not enough food. And we've shifted from that, from supply failure, to looking at famine as demand failure. That is about poverty, not enough entitlements, not enough purchasing power to access food through the market. And that was Sen, and his analysis of many famines showed convincingly that that was the case, that people's access to food is more important than the availability of food. But now we've moved to another generation of famines, having thought that those famines were part of history, and we've actually eradicated famines by the 1990s, let's say. There's now this resurgence of this new type of famine, which are very much about politics and failures of democracy, failures of social contract, intentionality, which there was always that in the past as well. I mean, for example, there are resonances, as I showed, between Gaza now and Warsaw in the 1940s. There's also resonances with Ukraine in the 1930s and Stalin's war against Ukraine. So politics has always been part of famines, but now this current generation of famines, Sudan especially, and now Gaza, it's 100% conflict. You don't even need a drought or a trigger to food supplies. All you need is warring parties in Sudan, these 2 armies fighting each other and everybody else getting trampled. Or you need this, whatever we call it, campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza to create famine conditions where there should not be famine conditions. There's no shock to food supply. There is no, lack of access to markets. It was all not great, but it was okay before October the 7th. After October the 7th, conditions were deliberately created that have triggered this famine. And I agree. I think it's a rolling famine almost. It's happening over a long period of time, but it's clearly a famine process which is ongoing, and that's entirely political. So we've moved way beyond climate shocks and Malthusianism and even market failure.
The next slide is collateral as well. Certain things can be sacrificed. Like in Bengal, it's all about the Second War against that was in Japan. And it's like that kind of subsumed in bigger or other definitions of what's actually going on.
Yeah, there's a bigger political context usually to famines, both historically and contemporary. So in Bengal in 43, for example, Churchill was asked to send food aid to Bengal, but he was busy getting food to feed the soldiers in the war. So the food ships went right past Bengal. And similarly in 74, there was a dispute between the US and Cuba and Bangladesh about Bangladesh sending jute to Cuba. And so the US refused to send food aid until it was too late. So there's always this political context in the background behind the famine. But right now it's become much more overt. It's like politics is the up and front center of the problem.
Any other questions? I mean, another comment I have from reading the paper is I think that actually how in Devereux classification is much more suitable to a context like this. Would you agree?
I'll ask Paul how he agrees. I've actually had some thoughts about the famine scales because I think that we were seduced by the idea that there are these thresholds that you can measure, you know, and that is something that you can put boundaries on and monitor an intensifying situation of food insecurity and thereby intervene early enough to stop famine, which was the whole point of the scale. But I think the main thing that's different between Howe and Devereux scale and the IPC scale is that we do use the word famine earlier.
Yeah.
And the fact that the IPC is so scared to use the F word is, I think, a large part of the problem of non-response. So if that's the one thing that needs to change in the IPC scale, if we could get that change to happen, I think that would be a big improvement.
I just wanted to say as well around that, the famine as process that you showed, that was really helpful. And again, made me think a lot around analyses of settler colonialism, structure, not event. So the same thing of kind of this long process, this long structure. And I also just wanted to share something anecdotal, which is a friend of mine and actually a researcher on an IDS project that Philip Muddy and I are working on. We speak daily. He's in Khan Yunis, and he said to we've obviously named many times how strange it is to talk across our very different positions every day. And I've said to him, it feels very strange to talk about my life with you right now. And he said, I want to hear everything about your life, everything about every day, but don't talk to me about food. That's just cruel. I just thought the psychological aspect of that as well, that he genuinely does want to hear my silly photos of dogs and so on, but he just doesn't want to hear about food, cooking, meals, anything. And it just, yeah, that psychological aspect of it as well.
Now ask an off-the-wall question. How many people find it psychologically distressing that we know that people are starving in Gaza right now? Does it disturb you? It affects all of us, doesn't it? It affects our psyches. It makes us feel less good about life. And that's another reason why it should stop.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for writing the paper. Thank you.
Thank you.